Welcome to Fluffy Peony watercolor tutorial. We will be using only 3 pigments to this flower head painting. Outline drawing is done, which is available for download. The size of the flower head and removing the excess amount of graphite off the paper. For this peony flower head, I will be using only 3 pigments, and mostly only 2, the third one will come in help. Starting with lemon yellow, permanent rose, which is mostly the main one, and perlin violet. Now let's mix these watercolors on a color palette, adding water, starting with permanent rose. For the second, I used permanent rose with lemon yellow. This color will be used at the very end to make more warmer shadow areas. And the third one is permanent rose with perlin violet. Remember to experiment with your own pigments and try to find what suits best. Now we can start painting, starting with the first layer with one section at a time, one petal at a time. This painting will be slightly different that I did my previous ones. Here is the main focus on making first layer really transparent. As you can see, water is also a very small amount. Look at this peony tutorial as an exercise to practice for applying first layer, really transparent those first layers. Make them with smooth transitions. Here we see that the base of each petal is much darker and the outer edge of the petal is almost white. And I saw this peony and I already thought that it would be a great exercise to practice gradual transitions from darker to lighter. And till the end, I will add another few layers and we will also practice fine brush strokes. This is not a painting of a perfect peony. This is more looser peony and more as an exercise for you to try techniques, for you to practice smooth transitions, smooth layer applying, and those beautiful, nice, fine brush strokes. Moving forward to the next petal, as I'm skipping those petals that are just right beside the one we just painted, so we are not disturbing the edges which are still a little bit wet, and going to that petal which is not in touch with the first one. Starting from the darker area with a round synthetic brush, I'm taking permanent rose and applying and pushing watercolors towards the lightest area. While the surface is wet, we can freely push watercolors, washing my brush towards the outer edge and smoothing carefully so it is becoming lighter and almost white at the very edge. While the surface is wet, I can move watercolors, direct them in that direction that I need. First layer is really transparent to build a very good base for the painting. And here we are really practicing how to do that. There's so many different size and different shape petals. So this is an amazing practice to practice this skill. Applying permanent rose and with the round synthetic brush, which is clean and dry now, I'm pushing watercolors and smoothing them towards the lightest area, gradually making that smooth transition. I'm also here not too concentrated on perfect edge lines. As I always mention, be careful with edges. Here I allowing myself to be a little bit more freer because the main focus is on the first layer and on the brush strokes. Also tonal values. Moving forward and taking mix of permanent rose with pearl violet. Mostly for this petal, for this flower, I will be using these two pigments. Permanent rose, you can try other pink pigments that you have, and pearl violet. If you have pearl violet, be careful with it. It's a very strong pigment, or you can try other very dark violet pigments, or you can try to mix using red pigment and blue pigment, but be really careful, don't make it too messy. It's important to experiment with those pigments that you have. And for this whole flower head, mostly these two pigments will be used, permanent rose and pearl violet. The lemon yellow will come handy closer to the finishing part when I feel that I need to add a little bit of warmth to the shadow areas. And lemon yellow with permanent rose creates a very warm pigment. And the lightest areas are cooler. That's why we need a little contrast in the shadow, but that will be later. Now we're still painting the first layer. There's so many petals, peonies, and this is only the side view. If there would be more higher taken reference, there will be much more petals. But for this exercise, this is perfect to practice your technique of applying first layers, understanding and seeing tonal values. I'm still constantly looking at reference for each petal. I'm not assuming something that it's dark at the base and light towards the edge. Still, each petal reacts with light source differently, and I'm constantly looking at reference, noticing those changes. How each petal is curved, how it is moving, where the light source is, where the shadow area. Now the first petal is completely dry and I can paint petal which is just right beside it, and I will not disturb it. Be sure that your surface is dry. Till this moment it should be dry. If your layer of the first petal is still wet, that means you are using too much water. The long time for waiting to surface to get dry, it only can mean one, that you are using too much water. It is harder to paint and make smooth transitions with too much water on the surface. This water ratio with watercolors, I know it is challenging for many beginner artists and not just beginners. It's a matter of practice and feeling. If your surface is for a longer time too wet and you are struggling with watercolors, sharp edges after drying watercolor, that means that you are using too much water. Try to use lesser amount of water. Try to use smaller jars for water. I also saw that if you're using a big jar, a big glass for water or a big jar for water, you tend to use more water in your painting. I have a very small glass, and even that is too big. And I have two glasses. One is for mixing watercolors, which is dirty, becoming dirty very fast. And the other glass is with the clean water, especially useful for applying first layers. I need those first layers nice and clean without any mixed dirty water. Moving forward with the petal, applying for the first layer. Here I'm using the mix of Perlin Violet with Permanent Rose. And making with a finer brush, moving watercolors with the finer brush strokes. As we can see in the reference, this peony has so obvious brush strokes visible in reference, and it's a perfect for us to practice this technique. Do not look at this painting as a beautiful piece of art. Look at this painting as a practice, as an exercise. You can do it, you can even do it in different colors. This is your choice. It's the matter of how you apply those watercolors. You can make this peony red, you can make it violet, you can make it blue. This is your choice. The most important thing is to practice applying those watery brush strokes and seeing tonal values. To see those tonal values, you really need to look at reference, really need to study where is shadow, where are halftones, where is light. And the smallest petals I'm applying with the finer tip brush because those petals are smaller, and with bigger round synthetic brush I will just go over all the edges, and with a finer brush I can be more precise, more accurate. The right side of this flower head is away from light source and it's more in the shadow, but still some tips of the petals are lighter. And the left side is very light. For now, for the first layer, I don't have a very big contrast between light and dark. A little notions of darkest areas and of course leaving lightest areas light, almost white. That is the important thing in the first layer, to keep those light areas lighter and keep them wider as they appear in reference, because after a few next layers they will become much smaller. If you from the first layer leave the lightest areas as they appear in reference, then after a few layers you will end up with no light at all. So always keep your lightest areas bigger, wider as they appear in reference. The smallest area here where the petal is curved and taking darker color mix, I'm painting straight with watercolors. I'm not adding watery layer in the beginning because the area is so small, and I can be more precise on the dry surface and apply straight dark pigment. These few areas on this side are very dark, very saturated, and will help us create this really realistic three-dimensional look, even if we are not too concentrated on realism here. We are not aiming here for perfection. Of course you can do that, you have a reference, you have a technique, but this exercise is more about practicing these skills. I'm not here aiming for the perfect end result. Now let's take a break from flower head and paint the stem area. First, we need to mix watercolors, and here I will be using another few pigments, which is lemon yellow. As I see in reference, it's very yellowish green, super warm, and the second pigment is sap green. And for the darkest area, I'm taking perlin green. And these pigments will do wonderfully for this stem. You can use other yellow, other green, or you can mix of yellow and blue and have also green mix, add a little bit more of yellow, and it will be much warmer. First, with the finer tip brush, I'm applying very small amount of water, starting applying watercolors from the darkest area, leaving the left side unpainted. And then with the clean and dry brush, I'm carefully smoothing both sides of applied watercolors towards the both edge lines. First layers are really transparent. We need to keep those lightest areas light and carefully adding more watercolors still to the darkest area. I'm mostly not applying watercolors to the lightest area because while I will be pushing and smoothing watercolors, I will have there some half tones and lightest tones. Don't apply watercolors to the whole stem and then struggle with making it lighter. Everything is going from from darkest to light, always from darkest to light. And with fine brush strokes, I'm applying very transparent layers of watercolors. I'm taking very small amount of watercolors. This mix that I made is a very huge amount of watercolors, just to show you how it looks. In painting, I will not need so much watercolors. Carefully pushing watercolors towards the edge line. And it's already looking three-dimensional because I have darks and I have lights and I have half tones. And that's the main thing that we need for realistic look. We need these dimensions. We need those tonal values. And with finer brush strokes, adding more watercolors, but still moving transparently, still moving gradually. This is like third or fourth layer. I'm not finishing stem with 1 and 2 layers of watercolors. It doesn't take too much effort, a little bit more than usual, just applying watercolors straight with very saturated. With a little bit more of effort, you can get much better results, more realistic. Lemon yellow, very watery amount, and going over with slight watery wash of lemon yellow. In the reference, the stem is really yellowish green. And now getting back to peony painting. With the round synthetic brush, I'm applying permanent rose to the shadow areas of these petals and smoothing the applied layer. Applying in the darkest area with wide brush strokes, cleaning my brush, drying in paper towel and smoothing the applied layer. The water amount, as you can see on my color palette, is very small. When I'm washing my brush in water, I'm always drying it in paper towel. I don't have a dripping brush on my painting. Before smoothing, I'm washing brush in water and drying in paper towel. I always have a paper towel in my left hand, and almost after each washing, I dry it in paper towel. That is how I control the ratio of water on my brush. I never go straight from water to my painting. It will be too much water on the brush because brush can load a lot of water. And again, washing and drying in paper towel. And amount of water on color palette you can see is almost a very like 1-2 percentages. Adding more permanent rose to my color mixes, to Pearl and Violet. And again, this is an exercise of how you see tonal values, how are you applying first layers, how you applying smooth layers, how are you smoothing the applied watercolor layers. I'm going very saturated because I'm not aiming here for perfect, peony, fluffy. I'm more going here for technique and the practice for you to try this technique of applying watercolors. Again, with clean and dry brush, I'm smoothing the applied layer. Going further, also important thing to take into consideration when you are applying layers. For example, now I applied once, I smooth the applied layer, and then I'm taking a little bit more of pigment and applying to the darkest areas once more. And that's it. You can't go for another third, fourth time to the same area because the area now is a little bit wet. And if you will go with the more and more watercolors, you can damage paper. Paper needs time to dry, to get ready to receive another layer. You can't work on the same area for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers. It will start to look messy, and you will, especially if you are painting also with synthetic watercolor brushes, after a few layers you will start to lift out watercolor pigment, not adding more. So I'm applying 1-2 layers in one take, then I go to other petal. I leave that area to get dry, to paper to relax, so it can receive another layer. If the watercolor paper is good, it can receive an endless amount of layers. Only if you wait between layers to dry, then the paper can work perfectly. If you will start to add more and more and more layers in one take, you will finish with bad looking painting. Adding more contrast to separate petals. Carefully, I'm working here very accurately because still my surface is a little bit moist, and I'm working really with the fine brush strokes. With greater contrast, separating petals one from each other. Working with the tip of the brush, especially the darkest parts are the part where one petal is touching the other, creating the little fine cast shadow line. Separating these two petals with a nice cast shadow line, it instantly creates this realistic look that one petal is over the other and creates the shadow area. I'm still constantly looking in reference. The more I look, the more I start to see. I now see details which I didn't see in the beginning. It's always important to have reference right beside you. You have the opportunity to download reference and open right beside the tutorial. So that's why I'm not adding a reference image into my tutorial, but you can open it just beside the tutorial and zoom in, zoom out, look at the specific areas that you need. And it's very important to follow along the reference while I'm painting. So you are also thinking what you are doing, not just repeating what I am doing, but seeing what I am doing and looking for those things in reference. Study each petal, each section. This is important. That's how you are more aware of what you are doing. Training observation skills is very important in realistic painting. Now I'm taking mix of lemon yellow with permanent rose. You can use only lemon yellow or cadmium yellow and go with watery washes over the darkest middle parts of this flower head, and it gives a nice warm touch, creating contrast between warm color tones and cool color tones also helps to create a realistic look. Everything at what we are looking have a cooler tones and warmer tones. If light is cool, then the shadow is warm. And in this case, this peony, and I'm like 90% of time taking all my references that the light source, light area is cool and the shadow area is warm. Only when taking in direct sunlight, but that is a completely different story. Then there's a little different contrast between cool and warmth. Then the light area are warm. Or if you are taking reference, for example, in your room light, then the room light is very warm and the lightest areas will be warm and the shadows will be cool, just because our room lamps have warm light. But that is not the best way and the best time of taking references. It will really mess with your really understanding how the subject look, because if you are taking picture in a warm light source, it completely changes the color tones. And I always try to make my references in a cooler light source, which is more natural to our eyesight. Everything that will look outside is have a cooler light. Also, my lamp just above painting, when I'm painting all tutorials, has a cool light. Then we see all color tones more accurately and realistic as they are in real life. And I'm painting further, applying more and more layers to the darkest areas, and as you can see, the outer edges are still light, creating this transition smoothly. Adding more Perlin Violet, adding more contrast to some shadow areas, separating petals. And as I create this more greater contrast, it really starts to look more realistic. Petals are separating one from each other. And now, closer to the finishing part, we will train fine brush strokes. We have a nice base layer of watercolor, and now is the time that we are adding those finest brush strokes that we see in reference. This Peony has so obvious, so beautiful brush strokes on petals. And I'm taking my fine tip brush, washing it, applying watercolors, and still my water is a very small amount of on my brush, and I'm making these brush strokes very fast. That's the point. If you will start really carefully applying those brush strokes, they will not look fine. If you are speeding up, trying to train your hand to, it's almost like dancing on a paper. You are very lightly applying those brush strokes with the very tip of the brush. Don't push your brush too hard against surface. Then you will have a very thick brush strokes. Just paint lightly, slightly touching the surface with the very tip of the brush. And going from dark to light, gradually lifting up a brush, you are making that line very thin and gradually disappearing towards the lightest parts. Mostly using permanent rose for these brush strokes, more saturated in the darkest areas, which is on the right, and more lighter on the left side, which is more lighter. This is the time when we are adding more details to subject, closer to finishing part. You can turn around your painting so that your hand feels more confident with your brush strokes going from darker to lighter. And train your hand to go a little bit faster, a little bit faster. The faster it will go, the more finer those brush strokes will be. This is the part for practicing fine brush strokes. You can, if you will use transparent watercolors for this, you can go endlessly, and the more those fine brush strokes you will apply, the more fluffier and realistic this peony is gonna look. applying more contrast to the areas that are really in the shadow. Using permanent rose with a little touch of pearl and violet. Applying watercolors and with round synthetic brush smoothing the applied layer, and the layer underneath is completely dry. Now taking pearl and violet and adding more contrast to the most darkest shadow areas. This is the finishing part, and we are adding more details, more contrast where we see that we need it. I'm finishing this peony flower head painting, and as I said in the beginning, this practice, this exercise, I'm not aiming here for a perfect result. I'm aiming here for practicing my finer brush strokes, first layer, how to make smoother layers, how to make those beautiful fine brush strokes, how to see all the tonal values that are in the reference. I really hope that you did this practice and not too concentrated on the end result, but look at it as a nice way to learn new skills, to practice your skills, to make your hand move a little bit faster with those fine brush strokes. Hope you learned something new, and thank you for being here. Thank you for watching this tutorial. Bye bye. See you in my next paintings.